right, I think we're ready to go. Can the audience hear me okay? Let's just make a quick check so that I know I'm talking to someone out there. You can type into the chat window. I also have the Slack window open. Okay, good. We're good to go. Let's talk about what you might do immediately to give your users a better user experience, because this is an area that developers often don't pay as much attention to, perhaps, as they ought to. So let's talk about putting this in context, because I did a workshop Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday that talked about UX design from start to finish and all about the principles and all about the process. And we had a wonderful experience there. But that workshop was aimed at projects where there's a lot of design going on. Typically, that means either greenfield projects where you don't have an application now, which is the minority case, but does happen. I'm actually working on one right now. Or that you're redesigning and replacing an entire existing application. And then there's other points on the spectrum. You might be replacing a single module, which is kind of like replacing an existing app, or you might be replacing a single view. And that's kind of where we stopped for that workshop. But let's be realistic. A lot of developers simply don't have the luxury of being able to extensively redesign what they've got. In many cases, they have an existing application and they're allowed to refine existing views and replace individual pieces within a view, but that's about as much as they're able to do. So that's where we're aimed at today, is what are the major opportunities for you in that situation to get some better UX. Now, what all of these have in common is that there is an investigation and understanding phase. What's, in your case, when you're trying to refine an existing view, that would mean what are some of the things the users are struggling with right now? What is inadequate about the existing view? And then there is an ideation phase where you go through the process of trying to come up with better ideas for this particular chunk of the screen so that the users will have a better experience. And then when you have several ideas, you go through evaluation. Now, the difference here is that this happens in a very rapid cycle. It might be half of an afternoon, 2 or 3 hours perhaps, that you go and observe some users and find out that this particular piece of the screen isn't as good as it could be. You sketch out some ideas, you show them around to some people, decide the one you like best, and then you're ready to implement. Whereas in a full UX design project, say for a greenfield project or a replacement, we might spend as much as 2 weeks with several days in user observation. We analyze those observations and we come up with lots of ideas for lots of different views. So I'm today looking at zeroing right in on the things that you can do for in that situation where you're just fixing an existing application. Now, first of all, where do you get the ideas? Where do you find things for improving your app? Well, the two main sources are examples you see in other applications. So any time that you can find something that's related that might give you ideas, you use that. And then the other major area is design principles, which that helps you evaluate good and bad ideas. Design principles are based in how we see and how we think. And understanding design principles helps us pinpoint areas to work on and leads us to improvements faster than we would get through just randomly going, well, I wonder what we could do here. So I'm going to be going through these areas, and in many cases, I will be talking about the design principles involved and why you want to, that motivate these particular areas as areas where you can make some difference. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is decluttering your screens, which is a huge issue for most developers. Most screens that I see in business apps today, they're just crammed full. And web pages tend to be the same way. When web pages, it gets expressed as you're having to scroll a lot, or you're having very long menus with things crowded into the rest of the page. So we'll talk first about that, because that's probably one of the best things you can do to improve your UX. Then we'll talk about emphasizing important information, helping users see it faster so that they can use it better. We'll talk about replacing data grids with templated lists and other things, because data grids tend to be overused. And data grids, in many cases, don't give an optimal user experience. And we'll see several examples there of how you might look at alternatives for data grids. We'll look at improving the search experience. It's been my personal observation that most business apps don't do as good a job of searching as they should. I'm seeing progress on that in the last 2 or 3 years. But for those of you who are still using more traditional searching in business apps, I'll talk some about that. And then finally, I'll talk about adding navigation helpers. In many business apps today, the navigation is pretty complex. There's just a lot going on and people have to dance around to different places. There are big menus they have to navigate multiple levels. So I'll talk about some of the things you can do to fix things there. Here is my example of a crowded screen. And some of you probably look at this and have that feeling that, yeah, I've seen screens like this in my own app. And so we're going to actually revisit this guy and talk about some of the ways we might look at fixing him. That kind of screen really shouldn't be the norm in your business application, because there are several design principles that help us understand that uncluttered screens are better for almost all circumstances. So some of those design principles include inattentional blindness, Gestalt proximity, Fitts law, Hicks law, horror vacui. And in my full course, I actually talk about 4 or 5 more design principles that suggest to us that we really ought to be doing less crowded screens. Let's go through some of those. Some of you may have seen this. I'm not going to show this today, but I put this link up so that you can look if you have not seen it. This video is of a couple of teams passing basketballs around. And I'm not going to tell you kind of what to look for there. You just go watch the video and see if you don't take a lesson from it. But I'm going to look at this design principle by doing a test with slides. This test comes from a book called Designing with the Mind in Mind by Dr. Jeff Johnson. So I'm going to show you 3 slides for a few seconds each, and each one will have drawings of common tools you might find around your house or workshop. Your task as I go through these is to figure out how many slides contain a hammer. How many hammers do you see? Are you ready? Okay. So how many hammers did you see? Well, most people key in on the fact that there are 2 hammers. The first and the last slides have hammers, and the middle one didn't. But that, of course, I did a little misdirection there, because I now want to ask you questions like, how many pairs of pliers were there? How many pairs of scissors? How many wrenches? And for the vast majority of you, the answer is you have no clue, because you weren't looking for those things. That design principle that you don't really see what you're not looking for is called inattentional blindness, and it comes right out of the way the visual system works. The retina has a very small area of high resolution called the fovea. You might have learned about that back in biology class and thought you'd never need it, but it actually applies to your work. The fovea is a very small part of the retina, and everything else has very low resolution. To get an idea of the size of the fovea, hold a typical pound coin or something like that at arm's length, or a bottle cap is about the right size. A full moon overhead on a clear night is about the right size. That's really all the high resolution you've got. So the way it's really working underneath, let's bring up my let me bring up, let's see, there it is. There, yeah, we've got several things that I bring up here. So notice there that there's a circle right there. And as I move around, the circle that's clear gets put in a different place. So you might have noticed when I put this screen up earlier that the person involved is Sherlock Holmes. You might not have even noticed that much, but that's probably about all you noticed, because this is a simulation of kind of how things are working. You're really only seeing a small amount of high resolution. So for example, you didn't see that there is a tab for dingleplops, which is a made-up word. It doesn't mean anything. You didn't realize that most of the stuff going to the right side of the screen is just complete gibberish. Your brain tends to filter that out because it isn't relevant to what you're trying to do right now. Since you only have a little bit of high resolution, you're constantly moving that high resolution part around to based on what your brain thinks is important, and the rest of it is just filled in with a convincing fake. And people don't necessarily realize that until they're forced to with something like those exercises for inattentional blindness. Let me get back to the slides. You can sum this up by saying users mostly see what they expect to see. They typically come into a screen with a task, and the visual system filters out anything irrelevant to the task. So you can put those crowded screens in front of people, but as we demonstrated, people don't really see them. They dart around looking for things that are relevant to the task they're trying to accomplish. And we can actually speed them up in doing that with some of the things that I'm going to talk about now. In particular, your most valuable tool for dealing with this is something based on a design principle called Gestalt proximity. And it basically means that you need to space the screens out into groups of related pieces of functionality. And that way, the users can find what they need faster with their fovea darting around. And if you're respecting that principle, you chunk things up into pieces. If you violate that principle, you will slow users down because they have to do more work to find what they're looking at. Here's an example from the real world. This is an actual hotel sign that I saw. Basically, you can see that we have the room ranges there, but where are the ISIN meeting rooms? Well, maybe in the top one because it's a slight bit closer to that, but we have to do some extra cognitive effort. There's some ambiguity. We're basically doing a little bit of guessing to figure out where those things are. Why don't we chunk things up like this? If that sign's chunked up this way, then the proximity of the big arrows to the groups of text tell us immediately which way to go. Now we know the ISA meeting rooms are definitely to the left. And that related principle in your computer screens will help people zero in on groups of related visual elements. Here's an example from software. So this was a spoof basically of a web page that was made to order hamburgers, and the author of this wanted the users to choose what condiments they wanted, but visually, when you first come in and look at this screen, it looks like there are two groups of radio buttons here, two vertical columns, because the visual system automatically considers that first column and the second column to be related because the individual visual elements representing a choice are close to one another. But in fact, that is really not what they're trying to accomplish here at all. What they really wanted is 6 pairs of radio buttons, and functionally that is the way it works, but it takes additional effort on the part of the user to do that. So if we do something like this instead and get away from the broad spacing of individual sets of radio buttons, bring those closer together, and then use some other visual tricks to help the eye assemble things into groups, now we've got something that is intuitively obvious and much quicker to use, and people are much less likely to make mistakes. Another thing that crowded screens often lead to inadvertently that developers don't necessarily realize is that they can raise the possibility of user error. And again, this is the problem that in this case it's proximity that causes someone to inadvertently select something that's closer to something else. This is an actual piece of software I did some work with about 18 months ago, and I was working with this button fairly frequently. That is the equivalent basically of code behind in many of the environments you might use today, except that this environment tended to generate a lot of code behind for you and then let you tweak it. Well, that was fine, but I had gone through a couple of hours of configuring the app the way I wanted to get the code behind exactly the way I wanted. And then I went to edit it one more time, and by accident, I slipped over just a little bit with the mouse and hit this. Well, the iconography is terrible, so you probably don't know what they're trying to tell you, but that wiped out all the existing code behind with no confirmation. Well, I mean, that's just a train wreck of bad design. It's too close, the icon doesn't tell me anything, and there's no confirmation that I might lose some important work. So I chewed them out about this pretty good, and they did do some fixes on it. And the fixes are fairly obvious. You want to move that button further away because those two things aren't really related, and then choose a better icon and then put up some confirmation. So that kind of problem with crowded screens is particularly an issue when you go to do mobile apps on tablets or things like that, because it's actually even easier when you're touching things with a finger to make a mistake than it is with mouse and keyboard. But I made this mistake with the mouse. I just absolutely clicked the wrong thing, threw away 2 hours of work. And that's rage inducing on the part of your users, as well as, of course, lowering their productivity. A couple more important principles that play into crowded screens. If you just squeeze everything together, now you don't have any room to do things like make buttons bigger if they're important. There's a design principle called Fitts Law, which says that users can find things more quickly, a visual element more quickly, a control element, if it's bigger. They can find it and click it faster if it's bigger. That particular little example there is from the website Imager, where they have the next post button, which is what you use probably 95% of the time, is nice and big and lit up and easy to find, whereas the back button is smaller. You can still find it and use it, but you don't use it nearly as often, so it's de-emphasized. The big button needs space in order to be called out, and I find that a lot of developers just think all buttons should be the same size for consistency or something. There's no law about that. You can make buttons people use a lot bigger, but you'll need a less crowded screen to do it. Another problem with crowded screens is they typically contain too many options, making it very hard to find the one that you want. I have gone into clients that had over 400 options on their main menu at the top. These days in web pages, we tend to see these hierarchical menus on the left side that just go on and on. And if you've got a menu on the left side and you're having to scroll to get to the bottom elements on it, you've probably got too many options there, and you need to think about some reorganization and trying to do some decluttering. How you do it, of course, is very dependent upon circumstances, but I am just going to suggest some things that you might try. So here is, let me see if I've got my thing over here. I'm sorry, I missed my Slack thing. I wanted to take a quick look at that to see if anybody was putting anything in there. No, I don't see anything. Good. How about my chat? Okay, good. Just wanted to check, make sure that if anybody had any comments or questions. Let's go back to this guy. So as I said, this is the kind of screen that you want to try to get away from, and you find yourself, as applications evolve, tending to move in that direction. As a general principle, screens never get less crowded unless you consciously make an effort to try to make them less crowded. They always get more crowded. I've got some, by the way, remember that this is kind of gibberish, and as you move aside, you'll see some wry commentary on my part. For example, if you look at this section, right, whoops, sorry, back. Let's get a pen here so that I can highlight this. You can see that my labels are making fun of the fact that people put a lot of stuff in, and of course, people won't even leave even just little squares like that open because they have this idea that screen real estate is still valuable. But it isn't really, because we can, with all the context switching capabilities we have today, sliding and tab controls and expanders and things like that, we can create more screen space. The problem is much more around how do people use it and get to it. So let's talk a little bit about some of the possibilities there. Oh yeah, I almost forgot. To understand, first of all, you will get resistance sometimes when you start to declutter screens because users are accustomed to it. That's what they're used to. They may tell you they don't want uncluttered screens. And the reason they tell you that is not because they don't like uncluttered screens. A well-designed uncluttered screen will pretty much always beat a crowded screen in a fair user evaluation. But the reason they tell you that is that they don't trust you to actually make a screen where they can find everything. That if it's not somewhere visible on that screen, they might take a long time to dart around and find it with their phobia, but if it's not there at all, now they can't see it at all and they don't know where to go looking for it. And that causes users to assume that if you declutter screens and you start moving things around and making them not right in their face, that they won't be able to find them. But we are making progress on dealing with this situation, because if you look at, for example, the phone, where we don't really have the option of having crowded screens, they've been some of the innovators in doing a better job here. This is the iPhone settings application, and as you can see, there are tons and tons of settings. I'm going to have to scroll a long way, and all of these have subscreens that get down to the actual settings. Well, with something like this, I would probably never find some things if I didn't have that little search bar up at the top. And because of that, I can type in a little bit and zero in on the things that I want. And that sort of thing, we routinely put that into our applications now, so that we give users the way to grab an option, find an option very easily. So let's kind of show, sort of having looked. Oops, sorry. Go a bit. Let's kind of show a little bit of. We've seen this guy, and this is sort of the very crowded example of it. And then let's see just the first step or two towards decluttering that. So we can make the thing that's very important, which if we know that they look at the person and the address and the city when they come in every time, then we would want to make that bigger and set it off just a little bit and declutter some of these other things. Maybe take that set of fields that isn't used as often and put it on one of those tabs with the other things that were there, and put some room around that. And then we're going to talk about how to fix this thing down here at the bottom, which is very crowded, because I've got that, but I'm going to talk about that in the data grid section. That right now we've got this sort of standard data grid, and if you pick on a row, you see the child rows, etc. So we're going to see some options in a few minutes about how to deal with that. So chunking things up, setting them apart, hiding things that aren't needed, and notice that we've got a little search thing there that would let you search within these tabs to find something if it wasn't obvious what something was on. And you know, it shocked me that the equivalent issue in Microsoft Word put the what's it called, the bar at the top that they have all their stuff on. There's a name for that particular type of tab, and for when they first put it out, oh gosh, that was way back, like before 2010. For many years, it existed with no ability to find things. And I would go from tab to tab up there at the top, and then I'd give up and I would go to Google to go, where is the option to remove the people pane at the bottom of the Outlook page? And then I would then know what tab it was and look carefully. But 2 versions back, they added this little thing at the top that says, what do you want to do? Let's see, what have I got for Word there? Yeah, so now tell me what you want to do up there, zeroes in on particular options without you having to flip through all of these tabs here. So we're starting to see that as a standard pattern, and because it is a standard pattern, you can implement that in your own apps. It does take a little bit of work, but it's not major surgery to your app to do that. All right, bring those slides back up then. So to summarize the crowded screen problem, you've got grouping and chunking. We're going to look at the emphasizing important information in just a minute. You can highlight things that are important. You can come up with ways. I've seen applications that kind of dim down things that you know aren't really important now, and sort of brighten up things that are important. Better organization of user options. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes too. Configurability to hide things that are not needed. In some cases, I've seen applications that have a little glyph right there on the screen for users to say, I don't ever want to see this because I don't care about it. And then it just disappears and makes the screen less crowded. And then progressive disclosure, showing information in layers. So for example, if you've got a list, you might not put a whole lot of things in the list. You might let them hover over that if you're in a mouse and keyboard environment to put additional information. This is a little list of temporary employees. What's the next layer of information you'd like? Well, you might want their picture so you make sure you got the right person, understand something about how well they match the job, what their skills are, what their available schedule is. That's the most important thing, that the most important data for choosing somebody for a temporary job. So you can put that in a hover, and then if they click the actual person, you go to the entire record that has everything about that person. So presenting information in layers is another way to deal with crowding, and that is called progressive disclosure. Probably the way the implementation of progressive disclosure you're most familiar with is drill down, where you have a master list, you choose a record of one of the children, and then maybe the children have grandchildren, and you continue down through the hierarchy. Okay, my second point, which is kind of related to the crowded screen thing, but it's important enough to call out on its own, because this is my candidate for the easiest thing you can do to improve some of your screens, because every technology you're using today, unless you've got some old character-based screens or something, every technology you're using, this is easy to do. And it shocked me back in even the 1990s, when we had things like Classic Visual Basic and Fox Pro and Power Builder and such, that people didn't take advantage of making important information stand out with size and color and shapes. And let's take a look at a sample screen. And by the way, I mentioned it, should mention that you probably have this already. If your base theme is neutral, that's good when it comes to trying to make things stand out with color. So I do recommend kind of not being too fancy with your base theme. Even if you're going to revamp your app, don't put a lot of gratuitous colors in it. This is a screen from an actual application that we did about 3 years ago. Notice along the top, I'm going to get my pen here. What color would stand out? Probably the purple would stand out good. So notice, for example, this is an important piece of information right here. It's been 17 days since the last time that we delivered propane to this customer. This application is for the management of delivery of propane and fuel oil. And so that's very easy to see. This is the first screen that someone sees when they pick a customer, such as ABC Company up here. This is what's called the customer hub. And notice how we probably need to know the billing address. That's very prominent. It's got some space around it. The contacts, again, we try to keep the screen kind of open and not jam everything in together, but we make some things bigger and stand out with size for things like that. They have 47 open orders. That seems like a lot. Then we see how much they owe us. And then notice, by the way, right under the company name is the COD. In America, that means collect on delivery. That stands out for color because this means a customer doesn't pay their bills as much as they should. So we want that to stand out and be easy to see. We have a little glyph over here on the right that says whether or not this is a happy customer. We would change that to yellow if maybe they're not so happy, maybe even red if they're really a very angry customer. And then the little smiley face is a shape that automatically helps us understand what we're trying to get at there. A yellow one would probably have a neutral sort of smile. It wouldn't have a smile. And then one that was red for a customer that was upset would have a frown. And all of those things help people very quickly get the information. And those things aren't very hard to add to existing applications. In this particular case, one of the most important things is how much fuel do they have. So we made a special visualization for that. And you can imagine icons and shapes and things like that you can get and you can colorize to help that kind of information stand out. Also, don't neglect, if you're using modern UI technologies, things like HTML5 and XAML, then you can layer things in the back to signal something to the user that helps them zero in on things. Like in that case, that's a wrench. These are customer interactions, and the wrench says that that's a service call, for example. So there are some of the ways you can help things stand out. Size and shape and color are your three main tools to help people see things in a better, more effective way than parsing text. And that gets to the next subject, which is related to that, which is that in most business applications today, data grids are overused. And part of that is because they don't do as good a job of communicating information quickly. You're mostly scanning text and numbers and cognitively having to read them. And so they don't make it easy to find and parse out the information that you want. Now, they're very flexible and they're very fast for development, which is why a lot of people use them. And there are certainly some use cases where they are probably the best interaction pattern that you can find. An example would be a financial application. That if you were doing a financial application, you might very well want to use a data grid pattern because your users are going to be totally tuned into that. But what I see more often is that data grids are used to allow the user just to select an item, because most of our common technologies don't really, the older ones especially, Windows Forms and things like that, HTML4, didn't have very good ways of formatting that information in a selection list. It was like kind of single strings to select, and that's obviously not good. So a lot of developers took the step of making it a data grid just to supply more information for every item. And that's a step in the right direction, because people do need more information to figure out the item that they want. But a data grid isn't necessarily the best way to do that in most cases. In most cases, templated lists work better. And finally, data grids for hierarchical data are usually a bad choice. So let's kind of go through some of the examples that I've got of alternatives to the data grid to see some of the possibilities. And the more modern your UI platforms, the more this is available to you. Some of these things are hard to do in older technologies. Some of the size and color and shape stuff that I talked about, that you can do that pretty much in any technology you have, but some of this depends upon being above a certain level of modern UI technology to do. All right. Let's look at the sports equipment card layout. Where's that one? Why don't I have that one up? Oh, it's a different version of Visual Studio. There we go. So let's kind of walk down through the improvements as we go, because there are several steps, and kind of depending on your ambition and depending on the technological capabilities of your platform, you might stop at a different place. So let's suppose we have some sports equipment here. And of course, being in America, and I talk about footballs, and footballs in this world are the oval things, whereas you think of footballs as soccer balls. So this would be a typical data grid with a lot of these different kinds of sports equipment in place. We have footballs, baseballs, volleyballs. This would be kind of the base user experience for a lot of business applications today, and somebody might highlight one of these rows in order to say that they want to do something with it. We might have buttons to edit them or something like that. Well, okay, that's functional. But see, as we move forward in UX design, functional isn't necessarily good enough anymore. People may very well judge our success on how easy it is to use. Well, probably the first step in trying to do something like this, to fix something like this, that a lot of people might take with modern UIs, to say, well, I'll put kind of a templated list box or templated cards or something. So this would kind of be the first step. You'd say, okay, yeah, now I can make the product name or the company name stand out. I can use a shape to indicate what kind of sports equipment it is. I can put the price down here kind of with some space around it, easy to find how many I've got in stock. So that would be a typical first cut at trying to do some things. But if I look at this and I ask you the question of how many footballs are there, now you're having to do that scanning thing. You're having to look around, and it's difficult because all of the items are the same size. Well, we have a design principle called mapping, which says if we can use the real world information and sort of incorporate that into our UI in some fashion, that helps the visual system in the brain find things faster. So we can have differently sized items. A baseball and a tennis ball can be smaller than a football, and a soccer ball can be smaller than a basketball, and that will assist the user's visual system in zeroing in on a particular piece of equipment. But if we're going to do things from the real world, well, different pieces of equipment are also different colors. So we might very well colorize some of them. Now finding the basketball is very easy, almost all basketballs. The standard color for a basketball is orange, so we can zero in on that, and soccer ball is white. And of course, we could put in like black panels or whatever. And that's nice, but we're still kind of scattered around. Related things, we've already seen this, related things are automatically grouped by the eye based on their position, and related things are also grouped by color. We saw that with the little set of radio buttons where we put a common background shading behind them, and that caused the eye to do some grouping. Well, we can then do something like this. We can sort and arrange for each category to have a different background color, and now we've got some grouping. So there's several steps we can take. We could take our data grid and notice that from a functional perspective, we haven't necessarily changed anything. We can still choose something and then maybe have a button to go somewhere else, but we have managed to make it quite a bit more approachable from the user's perspective. Somebody put in the ribbon. Yeah, the name of the thing at the top. I don't like it much at the thing at the top of the Office apps. And Eric, thank you, Eric, reminded me in the chat window that it is the ribbon. So that's one example of kind of moving from data grid. What's my other one? What's my next one? Oh, customer. Yeah, timelines. Let's bring that up. Remember those customer interactions that we talked about, where it might be a service call, it might be delivery of fuel, might be payment. Well, we've got a similar progression we can make there. You can imagine that we might just put the customer interactions in a grid, and in fact, version 1 of that program did that. Just kind of for time's sake, because we were doing so many other things with the UI, they kind of put in a grid as a placeholder, but everyone knew that was going to be replaced. Well, what can you replace it with? Well, first of all, you could enhance the data grid. So if you are able to put shapes into things to indicate categories, then you see there's that wrench shape. We use the wrench in the background for the actual app, but you could put it in a data grid cell. So and notice that this also opens things up just a little bit. So it's a little bit easier for people to zero in on records. They aren't squeezed in so tightly together. And in many cases, if you've got power users, they might really want the very crowded grid to get the maximum amount of stuff on the screen, whereas less sophisticated users who don't use it as often might very well like something like this to select a particular data item, expanding things a little bit, especially if for those users, you're not going to have very many. If you're going to be putting 10 or 12 or 15 in there, then you can certainly afford to space things out. In many cases, I see data grids that are returning 5 or 6 items, and then they're all squeezed together up at the top, and there's space below that the screen is allocated for additional data items, but you aren't using it. So in many cases, for less sophisticated users, you might very well want to use that space for a small number of items to spread things out a bit and declutter so that people can find things fast. And of course, you can put colorization and various things like that in. You could make the amount bigger. I meant to do that, in fact, for this demo and absolutely just forgot. So there are various ways you could enhance the data grid, and that would be your first step in getting some better UX. But I think with modern UI, we'd probably go to something more like this. And this is just a simple example of a templated list box. You can put all kinds of interesting things in there. You can, and of course, some things can be bigger than other things. The amount of money for a payment is big. The amount of money for a service call is big. How much money did they charge for that delivery? Boy, they got a lot of fuel, didn't they? But some people have really big tanks. You'd be surprised how much money some people need. So that would be more typical of of what people might do today with some of the newer UI technologies, HTML5 and XAML and things like that. But we have the potential with modern technologies to do even better than that. Because if you look at these things, you see there's a date. There's kind of a some things go together, and we know that by date. If we do a service call, then there's a payment that's very, very close in date to that. We might very well expect those to be related, but this templated list and the data grid don't really communicate that to us. But if we really want to get ambitious, we can put things on a timeline so that things that are related show up close together on the timeline, and we can make it so that we can zero in on an individual item very quickly like that. So those are some of the things we can do. You could imagine taking a data grid and replacing it with something like this or a templated list. In fact, in the app that this was used as a proof of concept, they actually have buttons at the top for the users to pick any one of these options for showing the data. That is something that I think is a certain amount of inertia on the part of developers, because normally you only do one way of showing data, and most commonly that is a data grid. But with modern data binding technologies, things like Angular and the data binding in XAML, now you can have multiple ways to display the data and give the user access to it, and just give them some kind of control, some kind of ability to switch between those views. Let me bring up the slides, and I think if I go back to that sample screen, I'll be able to show that to you. Let's go up. Right there? Right, yeah, let's get my pen so I can see this. Right here is the different ways that they have to display that information. So we've got, this is just a simple card view or a simple list. We've got sort of a gritty kind of view. We've got a timeline view, and I think that's an older version. I think the timeline hadn't been added at that point. So there are actually 4 in the app in the application today. So that's an alternative to data grids. Let's look at one more. So where is it? Ah, there it is. You already have that up. I do. Okay. I mean, you can imagine a typical data grid sort of thing, and that looks kind of like this. This would be equipment information, and I showed that in that crowded screen that this data was being shown in a data grid there. I wonder if I've got that up. Yeah, I do. Okay. So there's the data grid at the bottom that shows that information with kind of the expandability to show some child records thing. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, this expandable kind of way of doing things, that way where you have kind of multiple children there, that's not horrible. But a lot of data grids have that plus and then show the rows with another plus to go to another level. That's not a good user experience at all. Most people don't like that very much at all. So we've got grids and we've got data. What are some alternatives? Well, suppose that we displayed that information even just right there in that same spot. Suppose we displayed it like this instead. Notice that it is in fact exactly the same data. We can do a templated list, and we can use size to make some things stand out, and we can use expandability to get to the child records a little bit more easily. So here are the stops for that. Whoops, sorry. I'm sorry, I got the wrong version of that. Let me go get a different version. I was playing around with that version, made a mistake. Let's go over here. All right. Where's my window? I think is it underneath my? Didn't I get my file explorer there? Yeah. Where's see? I've got so many things on the screen I can't find my file explorer. Let's minimize some things. I still Can't find my file explorer. Oh, there it is. It appeared on this screen. I wasn't expecting it here. All right, let's go over this to my demos and bring that up. I think it's in here. Yeah. I should have known better than to show my experimental version in a session, but I was putting some interesting things in it, but not on that particular not on that particular place. So let's start this. So there's the data grid view, and there's kind of the templated item view. So we can look at the stops with some kind of expandability like that, and we can do interesting colorization to make those stand out. Use that common ground to make it really easy to see that. We can see issues in some expandable way. So that most users would prefer that over the data grid, just because it's easier to zero in on the things that they're interested in. And we can also do interesting data visualization when we start to use some of these modern technologies. For example, you could imagine this represents the stops on this transport load, and the colorization tells us whether or not it's likely to be late, and the shape might tell us something about what kind of a stop it is. For maybe that could be a warehouse, the distribution center. This could be some office kind of complex. So that gives us the ability to expose information with shapes and color and things like that to help people visualize and find things very quickly. So that kind of thing, as I said, could be slid into the place where a data grid is today if you're using some modern technologies. In order to see no comments there, okay. This is probably a good place that if somebody wants to unmute and ask a question while I'm bringing the slides back up, you're welcome to do that. All right, let's continue then. Whoops, I hit the end button, didn't I? Sometimes I do that. Instead of page down, I hit end. Sorry. Let's get down to where I was. Yeah, this is the next slide, so I'll start here. So there are certainly going to be places where you don't want to replace your existing data grids. And in that case, try to use those colors and shapes, as I said. And you also consider a card view that many data grid controls that you have now have the ability to drop down for the selected row, or in some cases, put something underneath the grid for the selected row that puts some detail there. And that's particularly helpful if you're going to use data grids. Don't put data grids that you scroll and scroll and scroll all, that they have to. People hate horizontal scrolling. In general, users don't like it. And so the more horizontal scrolling that's necessary in a particular case, the more it suggests that you ought to rethink the display of that information. So some of those columns that are way out there at the end, people probably never looked at them today. If you put that information in a card view, then they can get to it very quickly for a given record if they need it. So that's one of the things that you want to look at for data grids that you're not going to replace. Let's talk about improving the search experience, which is kind of your next heavy hitter. A lot of corporate applications have something that's usually more complex than this, some kind of form that you fill out to put in search parameters, and then you press a button and you search. And that's kind of been the way we did searching since the beginning of time. But I don't really recommend that today, because most people understand the Google way of thinking about things, that you just type something in, say you want to search, and then the application figures it out. Now, this is a little bit more surgery than some of the other things I've talked about. Some of the other things I've talked about really are just taking out one piece and putting in a better piece. In this case, though, there would be back-end work that would be required for you to be able to to take that search term and find stuff. But depending on the database you have, some databases have text-oriented searching that it's fairly minor tweaks to the database to get a new call that will present records that match a text search. Most text searches, though, do have some kind of expandability in order to get to an advanced search, because usually the just type it in thing doesn't really work completely in all cases. That's better most of the time. There's a design principle that goes with that called Occam's razor, that if you have two ways of designing something, you should normally choose the simpler one. So if you're going to search, a type it in search box is usually better than filling in a search form. However, even Google recognized that that just doesn't do everything. So you can go to the Search Tools button on Google. Let's get our thing there. Search Tools button right there, and then you get to search either with common times and with or specify custom range. And it turns out that that is the canonical example of why you want to have something besides just a type-in bar, because there is, I mean, if you're going to put date information in a type-in bar, that assumes a much higher level of understanding on the part of users, and you usually can't assume that. Particularly putting in date ranges, it's pretty problematic in the search in just a fill-in search field. So instead, you typically want to have something like this: make the common things they might look for easy to do, and then a custom range for really advanced scenarios. So even Google has kind of figured that out. Is that? Yeah, we're done with that. Okay. And finally, the fifth thing I suggest you do is that we have these business applications that the menu options just go on and on and on. I went into one that had over 400 options on this file, edit, whatever menu at the top. And I talked about that at the beginning of the session. But even web applications tend to, that menu that's typically on the left-hand side gets to the point where it's very, very long and you have to do a lot of scrolling. And then you start to see hierarchies. You click one of those menu options and there's sub-menu options to go with it. And in some cases, you click one of those and there's another sub-menu option that goes with that. We have to have a way to get to these options, but the bigger that number gets for just traditional menu structures, the worse it is for the user experience, and the more benefit you will gain from helping people not have to go through this long menu for everything that they do. Depending on circumstances, there are several possible things they can do. Similar to that ribbon, you can get some kind of a, what are you trying to do, or you can do a search filter option. The Windows 10 search bar is a good example. I bet there are quite a lot of you that you don't really, that the way you select apps in Windows 10 most commonly is to just type a couple of 3 letters into that search bar down next to the start button. I know that's the way I am. I don't know where that app is. I have no clue, but I don't need to know. That Windows will find the matching options and let me select one, and then I'm off to the races. So looking at that as an option in your own apps makes some sense. So that, for example, it might, I kind of showed this, that sorry, discard. I showed this in the thing earlier. Let's see if I can find it here. Launch window. The launcher window. Where did that guy get off to? I clicked him, but I don't see him. I must have put him again under one of these windows here. But one of the problems with trying to do online things is the windows for whatever software you're using, WebEx in this case, tend to get on top of things. So let's see. Let's put that down. Oh, I think I ran into an error on that Visual Studio. That's probably what the problem is. So let's stop that. Start it again. I'll show you the place I wanted to talk about. Because that Windows capability, there's nothing to stop you from putting that in your own apps. It is a little bit of extra work. It's a little bit more surgery than just spacing things out. But it's not in modern UI. It isn't that difficult to sort of build the structure that indicates here are all the options and here's where I navigate to in order to show that option. Now, it does help for these kinds of things if you have some kind of addressability scheme. So that's pretty easy on the web. In desktop apps, that might be a little more surgery in your app as well. But that's what you're looking for, is some place to put something that will help people find things no matter what tab or sub-tab or whatever that they're in. If you can do that and then navigate them to that, then you're able to really assist with the problem of too many options. But that's not the only circumstance there where you would want to give them some help. You might give them a recently used option. That's particularly helpful for recently used data records. In many application scenarios, people keep going back to the same records over and over again. I watched a user write down the IDs of the records that she was visiting so that she could type the IDs back in and get to them quickly. In other words, recently used lists are so helpful that people sometimes construct their own with paper and pencil. But of course, that's the sort of task that a software application ought to be doing. So you can have recently used options, you can have recently used data records, and the software should automatically keep up with those lists. The nice thing about recently used is the user doesn't really have to do anything for those recently used things to show up. You do that in the background. The same thing is true of frequently used, and sometimes that's better than recently used. Frequently used means you build a list on a longer span of time, that maybe it's customers they visit over and over again over a span of months. And then there's no reason why you can't put favorites into your own app. You don't have to depend upon the browser favorites, which sort of the structures there are different for different browsers and kind of get out of control pretty quick, and your favorites end up being mixed in with all the other favorites. There's nothing to stop you from having the functional equivalent of favorites in your own application. Again, addressability is important, so that's easy to do with web apps. If you want to do that with desktop apps and tablet apps, native tablet apps, you can, but you have to do some work inside your application to fix the addressability issue. Okay, we have about 2 or 3 minutes left, and I intended to leave a little bit of time for questions. You can type your questions into the chat window, and if I can find the right place over there in the, let's see. Oh, I got to get to the bottom, sorry, for this room. Oh, somebody likes Porcupine Tree, I see. Yeah, that's my favorite band, Steve Wilson, who is the frontman of Porcupine Tree. He's I think one of the very finest musicians of this generation. An exceptional man. So, do I have an opinion on pagination versus infinite scroll? Yeah, for either data grids or card views. Yes, I do. I find that most users don't like infinite scroll. And it also takes away the ability to put things at the bottom of the screen because you scroll down to see it and you just get more records. So it's there are places where it works okay, but I think it kind of became a little bit of a fad, a little bit of a trend. In general, I think most users do like pagination, but you have to make it very clean and very visible and really easy to see. And in general, when you paginate, my preference is that you paginate and scroll with the new pages, but that you don't take away the old data when you paginate to new data. Now, that can get you in trouble if you've got too much data. So you sort of build things on a case-by-case basis there. But the optimal, if somebody is looking at, let's say, 50 records at a time, is that you keep the previous 50 and stack on another 50 and so forth. In general, I don't like returning a lot of records. Users don't look at 500 records. So there's no point in returning that many. And that also kind of applies to pagination. Past a certain point, they probably aren't going to be scrolling through that whole big list. So kind of design to their circumstances, but present the information in chunks, hold on to the old chunks, show the new chunks of information. That's my starting point. for a design. Now, understand that I don't like giving absolute recommendations about these things because they think it varies too much with circumstances. There are almost always exceptional cases in which any design that's commonly used, there's probably a case in which it's the best design or close to the best design. So I don't want to be dogmatic about any of these recommendations. Careful with relying on color to convey information, as it would break accessibility. Well, it doesn't have to break accessibility. If it's only color, that's true. But what you want to do in general is to also vary, in addition to varying color, you want to vary the hue, so that when you've got red or green, that the red and the green still look different, even to somebody that's colorblind. And then that's where using shapes comes in as a good way to do it, because people with color blindness don't have any trouble with shapes either. So yeah, you have to be sensitive to the colorblind issue, but for that reason, you want some redundancy in your data visualization. You want to have hue as well as color, and then add in some shapes. Okay, I think that's about all the questions that I see, and we are out of time. So thank you so much, folks, for tuning in and watching me. You see, there's my information right there. If you want to holler at me and send me an email, I'd be happy to hear from you. And if you want to have me travel out to Europe to give you some help sometime, then you should contact me and talk about that.